But at the end of the day, I think there can be a real trap here for high performers that they are going to perfect and control this out of existence. And I'm going to wait until I take that next step in my development until I've figured it all out.
Hey, what's up, everyone, and welcome to the Fireside Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Turkington, and on the show today, we've got Carsten Grimm, or as I know him, Grimmy. Grimmy's an ex-military pilot and veteran, and he's also a clinical psychologist, so pretty cool little mix there, and looking forward to chopping it up with him today. Grimmy's also a good friend of Aegis Leadership and of the Fireside Podcast, so Grimmy, awesome to have you on, man.
Great to be back, Turks. I always enjoy our conversations. Thanks for having me back on.
All good. So, you've worked in a lot of high-performance settings, whether it be in the military context or with first responders, veterans, those types of things. But what I'm starting to see is, as we talk to more high performers and people in that space, even the people right at the top of their game, they still feel like a fraud. And I would have thought success might have had some type of impact on that. Why are these people still feeling like frauds, even though they've got arguably to the top of their games?
It's a great question, Turks. And I think imposter syndrome can sort of show up in a number of different ways. And I'm personally quite resistant to this idea of quick fixes or, like 6 easy steps to get rid of your imposter syndrome. I think the thing that I see a lot of clinically is sometimes your history, maybe your trauma history, can be echoing into the present moment. I know this personally. I've worked with lots of people who come from particular childhoods or past experiences where they've been exposed to conditions that have made them feel unsafe, and that'll get stored in their brain, mind, body. We get wired up that way. I see a lot of anxious perfectionism as kind of the fix for this, right? And that gets you a really long way. Like, you and I have both worked with lots of people who are like super sharp and driven and organized and perfectionist. But we've previously spoken before, you and I, you run out of road with that strategy. So if you're at a place in your game where you're noticing the things that you were doing that got you here aren't working anymore, that's hardly surprising. That's how this works. And this is a developmental process. Like you and I had previously talked about, us psychologists, we love a good developmental stage theory. And I think often, the folks who are going to be listening to us, they've heard, the hustle and grind culture. They love a good morning routine. They love, team #NoDaysOff. And that's good and admirable. And I just want to celebrate where people have got to. But that same attitude, notice how we frame this up. How do I get rid of my imposter syndrome? Right? That's that same tendency to want to control. And in a particular kind of therapy that I practice, that lots of us practice, we call that the agenda of emotional control, right? So I don't want to feel it. I want to get rid of it. It's often the very thing that keeps it going, right? I have a lot of compassion for folks experiencing this. I've personally sort of wrestled with this kind of demon a lot of my adult life, right? And what you need to know actually is that there are a whole suite of therapy techniques that can really support you to soften that attitude. Right, so that's the first thing. If you're finding that you're in a position and the environment is triggering you and you've got your history echoing into the room, right, that might be a really good indicator that actually there's some stuff there that you need to sort of seek some support around. You don't have to go it alone, but maybe you've run out of road with the particular strategies you've been using. That's the first thing. And a lot of therapeutic interventions can be very, very difficult to help you get back inside what we call the window of tolerance. The second thing I'd say is once you've done that, let's say you're inside the window of tolerance now you just are having difficulty with not wanting to experience this difficult feeling that shows up. And what I'd say to those people is just like, welcome to the party. That's how it is. I've previously written about, and you and I have talked about, that once you step outside your comfort zone, by definition, you're in uncharted territory. And if your instinct is then to tense up, control, clench, and try and control the uncontrollable. That's just a recipe for being rigid and stuck and prickly and hot. And am I sort of saying the right thing in this kind of way? And you can just hear it. You hear it, right? You can hear it.
Dense, robotic, all of that. Yeah, yeah.
Watching the scoreboard now, all those things that should be automatic and playful, right? They've gone out the window. You know that from your own sporting sort of history, right? When you start choke under the pressure, right? That's the mechanism. Our favourite team here in New Zealand, the All Blacks, have got this wonderful phrase, red head, blue head, right? And that sense of like now red head is starting to take over me and I'm getting into that fight or flight response. That's a pretty good indicator. But there are a whole bunch of ways of learning how to soften that perfectionism, because that's often one of the things that's maintaining it. In therapy, we talk about maintaining conditions. There's things that have got this started in your life, and there are things that are keeping it going. So there are things that you can do to learn how to manage that. A lot of that will often be around softening and making peace with and being willing to experience that emotional discomfort.
Yeah. And how would somebody start that journey? There's a lot there and a lot to unpack, and you'd have to get into some pretty serious detail. But if we find that we are those types of people where we step outside our comfort zone, but we get tense and we're like that white knuckle control, that's kind of our default way of being. What's a better way for somebody to attack that, or how can they reframe that in their own mind to be a little bit more constructive, I guess?
So it depends what's going on. And what I'd sort of say is like these things tend to be a journey and a stage of a process of development and figuring out what works for you. When you think about something like a growth journey, often we like to have this idea that we can find the perfect fix and the perfect solve. Right, there's going to be a perfect technique that works for us. And you and I can rattle off, positive self-talk and positive visualization and tactical breathing and all those things. And I'm not knocking all of those things, but the point I'm trying to make here is that this is highly individualized and you're going to have to test and adjust. What I'm pointing to here, Turks, is this is a process and a journey, right? And part of this, what we call in sort of my community, the hero's journey, often is going through this iterative cycle of things that just aren't working,
Hmm.
right? And they get your attention, right? And so that's a signal, that pain is a signal that what you've been doing isn't serving you. So it's time to update your tools.
Yeah, nice. And if somebody was going to look to start updating tools, and yes, I love that reframe around it's a practice meaning it's something we do over and over and over again. It's not just a one and done. But what types of tools have you seen to be effective? Or, where might somebody start? They might be listening to this saying, man, this resonates. This is definitely an issue for me. Other than, talking to somebody, a professional, or bouncing it off somebody they trust, where can they sort of start from a tactical, practical place? You know how I get down.
Yeah, great. So start the process of testing and adjusting is what I'd say. Start there. And you and I have previously talked about there's going to be something that moves you forward. How do you do your little review cycle of what have you tried and what's working, right? This isn't going to be a one and done, right? It's going to be something that you're going to be working on. If you're struggling with this, I know it's very tempting to think that there's a quick fix out there, and lots of people will sell you books and t-shirts that will promise that, right? But often this is going to be a process of self-discovery. That's the process that you need to kick off here. And that's going to look different for different people. Some people, they're going to need to learn how to slow down, right? And get into some mindfulness so they can have a better understanding of when their fight or flight system is starting to kick off. Other people, they're going to need to sort of learn to soften that sort of anxious perfectionism, all right? And allow themselves to sort of feel things they don't necessarily want to feel. But at the end of the day, I think there can be a real trap here for high performers that they are going to perfect and control this out of existence. And I'm going to wait until I take that next step in my development until I've figured it all out. It's all perfect. And I don't have to risk feeling vulnerable. Vulnerability,
I'll
mate.
just,
Yeah.
I'll just think and optimize my way out of this situation.
100%. I was definitely fallen into that trap. I'm sure you have too. We just come from that community, right? I think the military, veteran, first responder, hard charging, optimizer, life hack kind of community, that's very useful, and I got nothing but admiration who are right in the arena, like getting after it. But listen to it. Listen to it. That's the same mechanism that's keeping you stuck.
What stage does it become a problem? Because most things are a double-edged sword, having imposter syndrome and being a perfectionist and all of these types of things. There's probably going to be some massive pros that come with that. Hey, what's up, guys? Just a quick note to say, hopefully you're enjoying the show. If you are, feel free to like and subscribe, and you can share it with your mates. You can also find us at LinkedIn and on Facebook, or check us out at www.aegisleadership.co.nz. Cool, that's all from me. Let's get back to the show. At what stage does imposter syndrome and self-doubt and everything that goes with it, what stage does that become a problem in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question to ask yourself is like, what's showing up for you and how's it getting in the way? Like there are, I can think of times in my life where I've felt a degree of imposter syndrome showing up in a new role or standing in front of a new audience. And it kind of felt like, I was stepping into shoes or clothing that was too big for me. And you know what? I just had to grow into that. And that's going to feel uncomfortable. Right. But there's that willingness to experience it. I think if you're noticing that you are trying to fight with this and you're stuck with it and it's not workable, that's a pretty good signal to you, right? That there's a whole nother stage of development that's available to you, right? Yeah, you can go and talk to someone, or you can start that other sort of process of learning how to work with that.
That sort of scratched the itch with imposter syndrome for me, but I want to talk a lot about focus. So, we're in a pretty focus starved world at the moment. Everyone's vying for our attention, hijacking our attention to monetize it, whatever you want to call it. But is focus like a psychological issue or is it a discipline issue? Like, where do you sort of see that sitting?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a little bit of neuroscience here goes a long way, right? So the brain's got a couple of different attention systems running. It's got a sustained attention system, it's got a reorient to what's salient system, and it's got this default mode network, which is self-referential and what you're doing when you're sort of thinking about yourself and sort of daydreaming, right? And you're right. So what modern capitalism has done with social media is found a way to make a whole bunch of things salient, and they're getting those systems hijacked by things in your environment, right? And you and I have talked about this plenty in the past. What you practice, you get good at, good and bad, right? So if you practice having a hijacked attention system, scrolling, being scattered all the time, I heard one commentator talk about this sort of attention confetti, right? So you've just inadvertently been practicing getting reps on having a really scattered attention system. And I say this, Turks, with no sense of superiority. Like, when I get myself into that fatigued yellow zone, my brain is just as hungry for cheap dopamine as everyone else. And I can fall prey to sort of trying to get sort of a fix off my feed like everybody. But just notice what direction that takes you in. Like, it doesn't do me any good.
Mm.
You know what you need to do? You need to get off that stuff. Get some clear space and treat that in the same way. Oftentimes, I'll be honest with you, you got to treat that in the same way that you treat any other addiction.
Yeah. I was reading an article recently and it was saying that the future's kind of reserved for those that understand AI, but know how to achieve deep work. And obviously, to achieve deep work, you need a lot of focus. So, how do people go about training their focus? We're familiar with mindfulness and those types of things. What have you seen be effective in that space around training focus so we can actually carry out high leverage activities for prolonged periods of time? The stuff that's really going to push the boat forward.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different things here. And there's always a big overlap here with the recovery conversation that you and I are really fond of having. So if you're overextended, if you're overtrained, you and I previously talked about the brain's attention system. It's very vulnerable, right? It's very vulnerable to stress, fatigue, load. That relationship between those three brain systems I was talking about before, that can become quite dysregulated quite quickly. So again, very resistant to quick fixes. What I notice is this often ends up being a lifestyle solution. All right. So are you taking deloads? Are you recovering? Are you getting enough sleep? Do you have a mindfulness practice where you can really take some of that attention training to depth? Do you have a healthy relationship with your social media, a so-called like healthy information diet? If you really want to go to depth on your thinking and your job is to synthesize ideas, then you need to be using your brain and your working memory to pay attention and sense into those subtle connections. And what you need to do is you need to allow your brain, your subconscious, to roll that around, right? And find the solutions. One of my favorite psychologists, Daniel Kahneman, rest in peace, he's the only psychologist to have won the Nobel Prize, and he won it in behavioral economics for his work on biases and heuristics with Amos Tversky. And he was famous for saying, if you want to be really productive, you need to be a little bit underemployed, right? People waste decades because they can't waste a few days. So what's he saying there? He's pointing to the same principle, right? You need space. You can't just be on this treadmill all the time. It won't work. I just want to know what works, just like you. And if hustling and grinding harder was a solution, I'd be telling people to do it. It doesn't work when you want to go to depth.
And Thinking Fast and Slow, I found that book really, really tough, almost like a textbook, but some of the content in there is just unreal. But I was listening to a podcast with Carl Newport on it. He's big around the deep work. I think he coined that, and then having a hive mind, so that quick, reactive, checking emails, deleting messages, taking phone calls, that busy work that feels really good in the moment, but it's not actually productive as far as, pushing your goals forward. How do we do that? How do we carve out time for ourselves in a world that seems to reward this hive mind type mentality?
Yeah, for sure. So there's lots of different sort of frameworks around what's urgent versus what's important. Lots of things are going to be demanding your attention. That's never going away. So
Yeah.
again, we come back to a question of values being really, really clear around what's most important. Here's what I noticed in myself, right? So I finished a doctorate not that long ago. And the metric of success there is deep work, day after day, reps after reps. And initially it's quite hard. Right. So I had to detox off my social media. I had to fill my working memory with the right types of information. And it was difficult. And I used James Clear habits to track, word count over time. And I've read the science and the literature around what produces sort of good outputs like this. And that consistency over time, I noticed week 1, a little bit of output. Week 2, much more output. But week 3, Turks, was a rocket ship. And
Yeah.
what I noticed was once I got spooled up, the more I wrote, the more good ideas I had. And that's evidence-based finding too. A lot of people wait to get started, right? They're waiting for a good idea. But actually what the science would tell you is it's the process of moving that helps you to generate really good ideas.
Yeah. It's kind of the same with emotion, eh? Like I've heard something similar where it's like you're never going to feel like going to the gym, or if you do, it's pretty rare. But when you go to the gym and start working out, all of a sudden that feeling comes. Oh, now I'm feeling motivated. Now I'm feeling really good. Like a lot of the time, it sounds like emotion follows action. It's not the other way around, eh? Is that accurate?
Yeah, totally. Look, what you've just talked about there is one of the cornerstones of one of the most gold standard therapies, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And, what we're often saying in that modality is mood follows action, right? I had one of my supervisors say to me, it's a little bit like you're out in the cold and you're waiting to feel warm before you light a fire. Put it like that, it makes complete sense, right? But you can have a lot of compassion around sort of people feeling like they don't know where to start, right? Or they feel like there's a lot of barriers and they don't know what the right move is. The right move is, as you say, like get started and the rest is going to start to follow.
And something else I want to talk to you about is criticism. So I was speaking with James Lachlan the other day and a few other people with the recordings and in the background for various things. He was talking about people that he works with, even extremely high level leaders, performers, whatever you want to call it. Still, they don't only just struggle with the imposter syndrome piece we've been talking about, but they still really struggle with criticism. So, you'll have someone who's incredibly successful, whatever metric you want to use for that, but they're going to be sitting there stewing and ruminating for days over some anonymous comment that someone left on their social media, or, they're still affected by this. So, why does that happen? And what can we sort of do to deal with criticism more effectively, if there is such a thing?
Yeah, that's far more common, I think, than what we often talk about. Look, the reality is we're social primates, you know,
Mm.
and we care a lot about what the members of the tribe say about us. We're wired that way, without even noticing it. We're paying attention to how close are we to the chief, how close to the campfire, who's getting the resources, right? That's just out of the box settings, and that's not going to change. We've got this social survival instinct. So the first thing is like having self-compassion around that. It's like you're not gonna life hack your way out of that. But in a similar sort of way about how our histories can make us really, really sensitive to some of this stuff. Like I do think that we can have outsized reactions to things that are completely legitimate. And that is often, because of the types of histories that we've had. One of the pernicious things that I think people might not realize is that if you've had a difficult history with any kind of trauma in it, you're going to be really vigilant around potential threats, and you might see threats that aren't actually there. And so what that means is that a really legitimate, very helpful sort of comment has this, detonating experience internally, right? Because it feels like it's really dangerous, right? And it can sort of help, that can sort of get people outside of their window of tolerance. And again, I'd sort of put that in the same sort of category as the imposter syndrome. There are lots of ways of like helping to process that past sort of history so it doesn't affect you so much. And then there are all of these tools, acceptance and commitment and mindfulness practices that allow you to accept the discomfort of that. Yeah, I care about what you think. You didn't like my work, but I can reframe that, right? I can learn to make good use of that because that's going to help me move towards the things that I really value.
Yeah, and I was really curious there because, again, talking to James, he was saying around Richie McCaw, and we'll chuck up a clip, I think, that encompasses it because it landed with us really well. But he was like, yeah, not in these exact words, but you get the gist. He's essentially saying, yeah, look, a lot of people didn't like my success, but what they didn't realize was inside that was just fuel for me to work harder and essentially prove them wrong. So you're going to get people are different and they react to things in different ways. And we've discussed that quite a lot. But what's the difference between someone that gets completely derailed by some piece of random criticism or someone like, say, a Richie McCaw who uses that, reframes it, and it just becomes fuel on a massive inferno? Like,
Yeah.
what's the difference there?
Look, I love that, and been talking about the lessons, I think, from the All Blacks for quite a while now, in particular that period from 2007 to 2015, I think, which was a real pivotal sort of almost post-traumatic growth story. And and what I noticed, and I think what a lot of commentators have noticed, is that 2007, the quarterfinal defeat against France, there were a lot of things that weren't working. It's a little bit like that example we're talking about with the executive who's done a lot of really good things, but they're at a stage of their game now where what got you there won't get you any further. And then I think that soul searching that went on, this is kind of the heart of what you and I have talked about, right? That sort of broke things down and made them realize actually that there are things that we need to do to manage the realities of the pressure, right? And that helps you to refine your operating system. Because operating
Mm,
that you were running before, it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work in this environment. You have to try different things. And what worked before doesn't work now because the context is different. That's why you just can't keep, like perfecting your way into the next stage. You have to test and adjust. And I think what we saw, in 2011, I remember, watching Richie after the final, and the press were talking about the performance in 8-7. It was a very narrow victory. And he just said it plainly. He's like, yeah, it wasn't pretty. And he's sitting there with the World Cup next to him, eh?
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
I think that kind of shows you, doesn't it? I get chills even just like thinking about that. Like what that shows you is they went from this place of being sort of like naive about how pressure affects you. I remember him in his talking about this in his documentary Chasing Greatness. Like everyone feels it, but how do you deal with it? And they went on that growth path. They probably did lots of different things to grow their character and their skills to be able to like accept and manage and metabolize that pressure and turn it into something useful.
Yeah. And this ties into, you've spoken about window of tolerance a few times. Can you sort of just unpack, maybe for people that haven't heard that term before, what a window of tolerance actually is? And then how do we manage that window of tolerance? That would be quite interesting, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, great. So this comes straight out of the therapy world. It's not my work, but a lot of us use it because it's just so useful. And it's this idea that when you're inside your window, here we are, you and I having this conversation. We could be relaxed, we could be playful. Difficult things come up. I can manage my response. If I've been in therapy for a while, or if I'm sort of been using mental skills, I can use my skills, and that's great. And then something happens, a challenge or a stressor or a threat comes along, and I start to get to the edge of the envelope, right? So now I'm starting to get that hot sense of, like feeling like, okay, things are starting to get out of control here. It feels very uncomfortable. But, maybe I'm right on the edge and I can still use my skills. I can still accept and tolerate, be willing to experience the difficulty. The difficulty comes, and you and I have both experienced this, is when you get beyond that point now and you're kind of hijacked, aren't you, now by your stress response. And the All Blacks have this wonderful phrase, redhead, right? And now it feels like you're out of control. You can't think clearly. If you're someone in a high stakes environment, you no longer have access to your professional intuition. You can't read the field, all of those skills that you and I previously talked about, sense making, all those fine grained attention system skills that you really need, right? They're offline now because your brain systems are working. It's being outside your window of tolerance. So what we need to do is we need to de-escalate our fight flight response. And so we want to switch out of redhead, which is the sympathetic nervous system, and we're going to switch into what All Blacks call bluehead, which is your parasympathetic, your rest and digest system. It'd be easier said than done. Like, let's just
Yeah.
be real about that. You and I both experienced that, right? But that can be practiced, and you can be supported to have those skills.
Yeah. Practice being the key word. Like, this isn't just something you're going to pull out of the toolbox and it's going to work for you immediately. Like, you've got to find, I can only speak from my own personal experience here, but you have to find tools that work for you and you have to use them over and over and over again. And I know we've spoken about this previously a couple of times where the golf courses where I go now, I've finished with team sports and things for various reasons, but the golf course is where I go to punish myself. And it's a really good place to practice mental skills, reframing and arousal regulation around, you hit a bad shot and it goes out of bounds, happens to me a lot. You get frustrated. What are you saying to yourself? How do we calm ourselves down so we can recalibrate it and play the next shot? So when I need them in a situation which actually matters, golf for me doesn't really matter. It's recreation, but it's a good place to practice. But what it means is when I get to a place where it actually does matter, the tools are there and I just revert to them immediately because we always come back to our level of training, right? It's not something we're going to think our way out of. What do you use? What works for you and what have you seen work well for other people?
Yeah, that's great, and I'm exactly the same as you. Like I have various practices that I just have to use because they keep me well. So I have a mindfulness practice every morning. I'm sitting on my cushion and I'm sort of strengthening that practice. I have tools from different types of therapy modalities. So I work a lot with soldiers, sailors, and aviators and their trauma histories. So I use EMDR and acceptance commitment therapy. And there are tools from there around noticing your thinking and sort of learning how to unhook from it. And, to your point, Turks, about the golf course, I find even in just regular life, it gives me plenty of opportunity to use my skills. When I'm standing at the sink after a long day, up from the morning, or whatever it happens to be, or my daughter says something, or things go sideways at the end of a long week with my partner. These are all great opportunities, right, to actually learn how to put these things in practice. Right? Because, yeah, you're right. Like what we practice, we get good at, but also, again, back to that point about the developmental journey, right? There may be things that you need to be paying attention to that maybe you haven't addressed before.
Yeah. And for the high performer or control freak or whatever, you might have a situation where you don't practice your mental skills very well. Something happens and you react and it's very animalistic. And then after the fact, you're like, man, like I've kind of let myself down there. Like, how do we sort of be a little bit more self compassionate, because we're humans, we're highly evolved apes, like you've spoken about. We're not always going to kick it out of the ballpark. So, how can we be a little bit more kinder with ourselves when we miss the mark? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Look, I think we just need to be way more realistic. I think we've just painted ourselves into a corner with this high performance culture that if I just do these things, then I'm guaranteed success. No, you're not. Like lots of different things have to come into perfect alignment for things to go your way. And you can use all the skills in the world and it might still not go your way. Like the core goes the wrong way. We all know this. Right? There's expectation management here. I'm personally very resistant to this idea that we can just control everything perfectly and then we don't have to experience any of this emotional discomfort, right? Once again, that's kind of this agenda of trying to control everything and it doesn't work. You mentioned self compassion. This has been a really long journey for me too. All right. Coming from that kind of environment where any kind of a weakness is completely non acceptable and
Correct.
and you and I just previously talked about how learning to soften that internalized self-talk is just so helpful. No, like I wish I'd had adults in my life that were able to be those kind of, you know, I wouldn't say softer, but more realistic coaches. The really good ones who are like, look, mate, I'm sorry it's so hard and it's not going to get any easier, you know, but you can get through this, right? Take a deep breath. Get ready, right? It's gonna feel like this. You're outside the edge of your comfort zone now. It's gonna go a little bit sideways, probably quite often. That's the reality. That's the reality of being in the high performance world, right?
That's life, man.
That's life. Yeah, totally. So, I see a lot of this in the community that I work right with. It's that high performance world, trying to control everything. But if you're coming home and you're knife handing your daughter because she left a sock on the floor, like that's an example of like maybe the skills that you've been using don't translate very well.
What else are you seeing out there in the leadership and high performance world that's pissing you off at the moment? Misinformation or, just stuff that doesn't stack empirically? Or what else are you seeing that's catching your eye? You're like, "Do you know what? I think we've missed the mark here a little bit."
I think there are lots of different ways to be effective out there in the world, and I get concerned that we've produced kind of a caricature of what leadership looks like, particularly in the circles that you and I travel in, right? Think in the environments that we come from, Turks, being strong, stoic, self-reliant, sort of, I think that can produce a bit of an image. But I think Brene Brown's work around this is really informative. She talks about how that perfectionism is kind of a 20-ton shield, I think she calls it. And, we're not talking about standing around hugging, but we are talking about being way more realistic with one another. You and I have both talked about this idea of psychological safety, one of the cornerstones of high performance teams. Consult your own experience too. The times when you've been around other operators and you can be real with them. It's like, man, I don't know about this. And they're like, yeah, bro, I don't know about this either. But you know what?
It's a
Like,
relief.
oh, it's such a relief.
It's a relief. You're like, "Oh, thank
Oh,
God. We
man,
can
I'm
just
not
talk we
going
can just talk
home.
openly here." Yeah,
Ah, you just drop it. It's like in your body, right? You can shrug the backpack off and you're allowed just to be a real dude who like really cares about this. It's one of the things we talk about in acceptance commitment therapy is like, notice where the pain is, flip it over. That's where your values are. Right. So yeah, you're gonna feel this like if you really care about it. Like what I love, and I think what a lot of us love in these communities is like being around other people who care passionately about these things just as much as what we do. Again, we're social animals, man. Like I think we're just wired to come together to go and do things that are extremely difficult. And I think when we can be real and have that sense of psychological safety, I've said this to you before, mate. The threat then isn't in here. The threat's out there. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of us, particularly in the veteran space, is we really miss that when we leave the service, right? Because we had that real close sense of camaraderie, like other people have got our back and I can be real with them and they know what's going on with me and I know what's going on with them, right? And that is something that is really primal and really bonding,
yeah,
right?
there's no insider threat we've gotta manage.
100%. Yeah.
So cool. And what do you think actually matters most? Like, for somebody that's sitting here now, they're like, "I really wanna start pushing the needle, the way that I perform under pressure," or whatever it might be, high stakes environments. What do you think matters most? if you want to be good in those types of situations? Tough question, I know. What do you think matters most?
Again, I think you can notice from my reaction, like I'm resistant to the idea of
Yeah,
the one thing.
yeah,
Like I get it, Turks, believe me, like the environments that we come from, we love the SOP answer. This is how it is, right?
yeah.
We'll just get on with that, right? And that's that. I have spoken to you previously and I sort of stand by this. Like figure out a way to do the work that sits beneath your work. Right. I'm really curious about this idea that entrepreneurs who have failed a few times then go on to become successful. Why is that? Right. It's because they've probably had some kind of an experience that's really sort of shattered their worldview and they've had to pick up the pieces, just like the All Blacks 2007. But you don't stop there. You don't hang it up there. You're learning and you're iterating as you go. I think that's the most important thing.
And do you think like you've almost got to have a catastrophic failure or be drawn to ground zero in some way, shape, or form to get really honest with yourself?
You know,
Is that required, or what do you think?
I don't think it's necessary. Like, I hope it's not necessary. But I mean, you and I both know, like, and I've been this way myself, like there have been times when I've burnt out before and there was no talking me out of it, and when I interviewed service members about their mental health recovery, a lot of them said kind of the same thing as like, there were certain things around mental health and self-care and well-being I didn't care about before. And you couldn't have changed my mind. And in psychology, there's this well-known framework called the stage of change. Right. And it's this idea that, you might be someone who's not even thinking about changing. You believe in your perfectionism and your over control, and that's you and your resistance in the other idea. And then maybe you start like listening to other sort of perspectives and maybe you start thinking about change. And then maybe you start putting some tools into practice and then you're really on that change journey. But you can kind of see like if you're someone in what we'd call like a pre-contemplator, it's like there is no problem here, right? Then you are stuck and it'll probably take something to come along and really rock your world a little bit before you can get unstuck.
Yeah. And why do you think it's so difficult for strong people to ask for help?
Yeah, as a topic that's pretty close to my heart. So let's take our community, Turks, right? So the military veteran first responder community. What's the first thing that we teach when you step off the bus or you step off the herc on recruit course? So you should say,
Essentially, yeah, yeah. Weakness isn't, it's not really acceptable. Failure is not really acceptable. Yeah.
it's you self-sacrifice for others, right?
Courage, comradeship, integrity, all of those types of things.
Exactly. And the things that, those communities need to do, let's be straight, that's what works. And extremists, like you need that. They're adapt.
It's a tough business, man.
It's a tough business. And I love how we've talked about this in the past. There aren't really any like tips or hacks or anything like that when you're out there in the pointy end, like it's tricky and it's messy and it feels raw and it feels real. And we need to socialize for that. We need to have this strong form of like almost kind of an ethnicity, right? This belief system that can be very difficult to manage when you're having a hard time, like I've got nothing but empathy for this, right? So you've been doing that, you've been getting after it, your life has been going sideways, and now you're expected to do this very sophisticated values pivot while you're really struggling, right? Like, of course you can't do it. It's really, that's too much to ask.
Yeah.
Like a lot of these operating systems aren't that compatible. Like I really noticed that in the world that I'm in, the military veterans, the strong, stoic, independent, like the kind of world that we've been talking about. And then oftentimes, because I straddle these two worlds, kind of the therapy culture, right? And there's a different messaging and there's different language there. And it's like, oh, self-care and have good boundaries and take some time off. And you can hear it, right? Like that's oil and water, these two cultures. And you can learn to bridge that. But if you're in this one, right, it can be very difficult, right? If you're having a hard time because you're not thinking clearly, you're probably just trying to survive. You're probably doing more of the things that we've been talking about. My default response, when I got fatigued, probably similar to yours, was just to work harder.
You just need to lean in a little bit more. Just grind your way out of it. How do they start to bridge that gap, Grimmy? The
Yeah.
strong person, whoever that is, how do they start to bridge that gap?
I think, you and I previously talked about, I think some people, this kind of advice, it always just bounces off them, and I've been there, you've probably been there. And it's your classic sort of hero's journey. I think analogy is like sometimes you can be really resistant to the call to change, and it'll take something to catalyze either a friend reaching in or something goes wrong in your life. And then it's like, okay, I can start to sort of put the pieces back together and learn from that. Your classic sort of All Blacks post 2007 road to recovery kind of journey. That's not necessary though. Like you can course correct. And I guess what I kind of hope, and I think I am starting to see some of this too, is like more people are sort of developing this awareness. Actually, like there are some alternatives. You can learn this lesson before you sort of life comes along and sort of flips the table of your life. You can start to learn some of these skills, right? And I hope that does land with some people who need to hear it.
Yeah. This is the last question I really want to ask you today, and this will be the first of many chats, I'm sure. But what's one mental battle that if somebody was able to overcome that would change a huge amount in their lives for the better?
I think there is a principle that kind of all humans have wired in, and that is I want to feel nice things, pleasant things, and I don't want to feel things that are challenging or difficult. Perfectionism, hence this tendency to over control. I was like that. My history, my early experiences in the military, if I can hide my distress well enough, and if I can be perfect enough, I can avoid anything that feels threatening or vulnerable. And you run out of road with that. I ran out of road with that. And that has catalyzed and does for lots of people this process of learning to actually be with, accept and tolerate, maybe make a little bit more peace with some of the messy, difficult realities of being a human that cares about things, that's got skin in the game, that wants to get after something that's really important to you. You flip over that, right? Yeah, that's where the pain is, right? And learning to not be afraid of those feelings, learning how to kind of befriend them, right? Listen to them, manage them, right? But hold them in a way that they're not any longer controlling you, keeping you from getting after the things that are really important to your life, right? Because, oh, that's scary. I don't want to go there. So I'm just going to stay in my safe little box. I would really hope that more of us would be able to be supportive of one another around that, right? Yeah.
It's a great place to finish. And hey, man, no doubt this chat would have landed with a lot of people. How do they find you, Grimmy? Where can they find you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. I write a series on military mental health and other topics around high performance on Substack. You can find me at Carsten J. Grimm.
Highly recommend being a subscriber and a regular reader, man. It's good stuff. So I'd recommend that to anybody. Hey, Grimmy, thanks so much for coming on, man. As always, it's been a pleasure. And thanks for being a good friend of the show and of Aegis Leadership. And we look forward to having many more chats in the future.
Thanks, Turks. Looking forward to the next chat already.
Cool. Nice. Hey, guys, and if it landed with you, you can check us out at www.aegisleadership.co.nz, or you can follow us on LinkedIn or Facebook. Hopefully you enjoyed the chat, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.